Good evening. Welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II discussion fall series. A number of people are still logging in. I'm going to put a link to our speaker's book in the chat. Obviously, please click on it. Bear with me one moment. Apologies for that. I got a minor fire drill, but I'm going to put the link to our speaker's book in the chat, and we'll go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started again. This link to our speaker's book is in the chat. Thank you for joining us this evening for the latest lecture of the World War II discussion forum fall series. I'm Greg McNiff, the founder and executive director of the group. I just want to cover the usual housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take some questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker in the audience when asking a question. We'll take about maybe 20 to 30 minutes of questions and end at about 9 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, we do have a YouTube channel. Please see the icon at the top of the website. Fourth, and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this evening's speaker. Peter Fritzsche is the W.D. and Sarah E. Trowbridge Professor of History at the University of Illinois and the author of 11 previous books, including First 100 Days and the award-winning Life and Death in the Third Reich. He lives in Urbana, Illinois. This evening, Peter will speak on his forthcoming book. I believe it comes out today or very
It does, yeah.
Does. 1942, When World War II Engulfed the Globe, which offers a gripping ground-level portrait of the decisive year when World War II escalated to global catastrophe. The reviews have been stellar. I'll just quote two. Sheila Fitzpatrick, author of The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, states, simply magnificent. A remarkable rethinking of the upheavals across the planet in a key year of World War II. 1942 is bold in conception, rich in detail, and a riveting read, while Richard Overy, author of Blood and Ruins, concludes that most histories of World War II are written with an outcome that everyone knows. But what if the clock were stopped in the midst of a global war? Peter Fritzsche has done just that, offering an intriguing perspective on a world at war. This panoramic narrative reminds us that nothing in history is inevitable. And with that, I will turn it over to Peter.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for coming this evening. I had conceived the book as a way to get at the global scale of World War II, but also all the issues that concern global sovereignty and the global future, all the ethnic conflicts, the labor conflicts, the anti-imperial struggles that are inside of the struggle between the Allies and the Axis. And I wanted to get a little bit the temperature, the feel of the war. So that meant I could not do the whole thing, especially if I wanted to go around the world. And 1942 was the year when all the belligerents are now finally, are indeed in the war. After Pearl Harbor, Japan declared war on Britain and the United States. Germany's declared war on the United States. The sides are set up. The only missing link, so to speak, is Japan and the Soviet Union have a non-aggression pact, which holds until the very end of the war, August 1945. Dealing with just 1 year, I also don't think about major turning points that then lead to victory, which would tip the book much more into a military-only history, and I wanted to combine the domestic and the military, or the different varieties of military struggle in 1942. And so it's basically from Pearl Harbor to the defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad on the 2nd of February, 1943. And I don't do everything, but I try to cut across a wide variety of geographic arenas, from the Philippines to South Africa to California, and a variety of genres, varieties of experience, including the music and dancing in World War II, refugees, the genocides and enslavement of peoples, as well as the military experience, that is to say, soldiers. I talk about the merchant marine, I talk about bombers and the bombed, as well as the big offensives that we see run by the Axis. So you have a German offensive in the spring and summer of 1942, undoing much of the harm that the Soviets had inflicted during the Winter War of 41, 42. And of course, you have a major Japanese offensive in the Pacific arena after Pearl Harbor, after December 7th, 1941. And so these two great offensives are just blasting across the world, changing it very much, and at a dizzying pace. I mean, the Japanese by March are on the borders of India, and the Germans by August are really posed to head down to Iran and Iraq. They're about 500 miles away. Even so, you could argue that in 1942 there are, or 41, 42, there are turning points, in the sense that, in retrospect now, it seems difficult to imagine that the Germans would prevail against the Soviets. Having not knocked out the Soviets in 6 or 8 or 12 weeks, as Hitler had assumed would be the case, this was going to be a war of attrition. It was going to be a long war. Whether that was clear in August or September, it's actually most historians argue, or somewhat later. The Germans were in it now for the long haul, and that was clear certainly by October, November 1941. It's also difficult to imagine, short of a very, very short war through immensely successful aggressive actions by the Axis, that the Allies would not have won with their superior military capacity, mostly the United States, but also the Soviet Union. But 1942 didn't feel like there were turning points. And this is a photograph of the Japanese attack on Ford Island, supported by a fleet, including aircraft carriers, with this surprise attack some 3,000 miles to Pearl Harbor. And it was coincided, and we can go to the next slide, with Japanese attacks all over the Pacific. So on Guam, Wake Island, attacks on Midway, attacks on Hong Kong, attacks on Malaya, and landing about 15,000 troops that on December 8th in northern Malaya, bombing of Singapore not long thereafter on Rangoon, bombing of American air bases in the Philippines, and Manila would be captured by year end, as well as attacks on Batavia, the Dutch East Indies, which becomes Indonesia. So it's an immense realm. It's about 10,000 miles across, that the Japanese had suddenly, within weeks, conquered. And so that was a very swift and continuing attack. And they consolidated with attacks on the Solomon Islands, on Borneo, and eventually taking Burma, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and Philippines as occupied countries to add to their empire, which is in the darker blue in China, and of course, Korea and Taiwan. So this was immense. And Singapore, the capture of Singapore on the 14th of February, 1942, is really a crucial moment because it was seen as impregnable. It's a major British naval base. And for commentators everywhere, American, British, Japanese, German, it really spells the probable end of the British Empire. So Singapore is an absolutely singular event. And when Japanese propaganda say, the ground shook when the Japanese entered Singapore in many ways, they were right. And the United States rethought security in the Pacific, that it would be dependent on Asian self-determination and independence. And that's why they had defended China against Japan. And so a lot of obituaries were written about the end of the British Empire after Singapore. And by May, the German counteroffensive in the summer of 1942 has taken shape. It's of a smaller scale than the invasion in June 1941. But it goes amazingly fast. So they recapture Sevastopol and Crimea and go into the Caucasus and the lower Don Valley. And the goal is to destroy the Red Army, which keeps running away. So they're in hot pursuit of the Red Army. But along the way, they're just taking real estate, taking cities. And it's a black summer for the Soviet Union, almost entirely erasing the morale that had been heightened and invigorated by the Soviet winter offensive in December and January and February, several months earlier. Can we have the next slide? I'm trying to pull up mine. And the great fear was in the summer of 1942 that there would be coordinated attacks by the Japanese, who would continue to move into the Indian Ocean, moving westward, maybe bypassing India, maybe conquering India, but in any case, creating a lot of trouble in the Indian Ocean, making it difficult for Britain to supply Egypt through the Suez Canal, or get oil from Iran and Iraq. And that would be coordinated, the fear was, with a German pincer movement coming out of the Don Valley into northern Iran and Iraq. And the second pincer, which was in place at the time by late June 1942, with Rommel and his Afrika Korps having crossed the border to Egypt and staying put for the time at El Alamein. So they were about 70 miles from the Suez Canal. And the British evacuated their naval positions to Haifa and Beirut. Refugees streamed into Palestine. There was a sense that Egypt was about to fall. And historians look at this moment, not just the high noon, so to speak, of Nazi conquests and Japanese conquests, but their possible coordination centered on the Middle East, as were these two German pincers centered on the Middle East, as the one possible moment when one could imagine an Axis victory before American industrialization kicks in. And that took almost a year, breakneck pace in the United States, but it wasn't ready in the summer of 1942. So if it was at all possible to imagine an Axis victory, this is the moment. It would have been the summer, the summer of 1942. It's at this time that the very first counteroffensives led by the Americans takes place. And we think of two sites that are very important, Midway and Guadalcanal. And I'm going to show you where Guadalcanal is, and no one knows really where it is in the Solomon Islands. It's very far away. So the next slide. So it's just northeast of Australia. The Japanese had already been building an air base there, and the United States wanted to interdict those efforts. And so the plans were to contest Japanese occupation of the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal in particular. And it was exactly 8 months after Pearl Harbor that American Marines landed on this small island. It's about the size of Long Island, and began to contest the Japanese at Guadalcanal. 2 months previous, there had been the amazing, no one spares adjectives to describe the naval battle of Midway. But the fact of the matter, and the Americans achieved an amazing victory. They destroyed the aircraft fleet of the Japanese, and the Japanese never rebuilt it, whereas the Americans continued to build onto theirs, whatever their losses. And it was a stunning blow. But Midway was luck. The Americans had basically lost the battle by 10 a.m. They had, we talk about kamikaze missions in 1945. Well, that's more or less what the Americans were doing from their aircraft carriers and from Midway Island itself. All had failed with horrific casualty rates, except at the very end, a high altitude bomber squadron comes when Japanese military fighters are much lower, and they hit the Japanese carriers at the very worst moment for the Japanese and destroy the four operational aircraft carriers on that mission for Japanese aircraft carriers. So it was an American victory. It was a total fluke, a complete, total lucky fluke. Both sides had made mistakes, but ultimately it seemed that the Japanese would prevail, at least in the naval battle. Probably wouldn't have conquered Midway. But the Americans pulled it off because luck allowed them to do so. Guadalcanal was also an end run thing, very close, at least at the beginning. The battle for this island was really a battle to land material, to land guns and food in order to support the troops. There were plenty of troops there. Each side had about 20,000, but you needed to land supplies. And the Americans were able to land supplies, and the Japanese were not. The Americans suffered enormous naval losses. This is where the Juno disappears, and the Juno has the four brothers on it who all die. Terrific naval losses in October and November suffered by the Americans, but they got the supplies through. And the Japanese did not. And ultimately, there were far more cases of Japanese starvation on Guadalcanal than combat deaths, and the Americans were able to prevail. But that was not clear at the beginning. And the New York Times even wrote an epitaph for the heroic soldiers of Guadalcanal. And the big famous reportage, Into the Valley, by John Hersey, who then wrote Hiroshima, is also a story about operational defeat and shell shock. So Guadalcanal too was quite close, and it really depended on the luck of those a beleaguered American Navy landing supplies. Then we can turn our attention to the. We'll go just do one picture. I couldn't find any non-heroic pictures from Guadalcanal, called "The Green Death," "The Green Hell" by Marine veterans. If we can go to the next slide, just gives you a sense of the difficulty. And that's what John Hersey published when he wrote Into the Valley, 1943, but also in Life magazine, which was excerpted in October, November. Finally, the next battle At Stalingrad, it has the attention of the entire world, and it goes on from late August to really early November, 1942, Stalingrad. And if we can have the next slide, the Red Army is pressed against the west bank of the Volga River, and they've lost the suburbs. The Germans have entered the city, and headlines uh, each day talk about the progress of what's going on. It's not progress, it's just seesaw. But the headlines say that Germans advance, then the Russians stop the advance, hold the Germans, Germans attack again. And it's a seesaw battle. The Soviet forces are ultimately split. The factory district in the north is then separated by the Germans from the downtown and the landing piers in the south. And the battle is followed by city maps. So the German commanders have to use city maps, and the newspapers are publishing city maps. So everybody knew where the railway station was, where the department store was, where the tire factory was, where the tank factory was, occurring in tiny amount of space. And at one point, the Russians in the north are squeezed to within 500 yards of the river Volga. And Hitler declares in early November, we've won. I mean, we just have to mop them up. There are a couple of spots, but basically we are in command. And if you look at sort of the big picture of Stalingrad and what's been happening since August, that would seem to be the case. But the Soviets are not gone. And so this battle of Stalingrad is also extremely, extremely close. And it's vital that it stays close, that the Soviets hang on, because in fact, the heroic Soviet armies in Stalingrad are bait. They're bait to keep the Germans as far east as possible, as close to the Volga combat zone as possible, so that the Soviets can pull off this major operation hundreds and hundreds of miles to the west that will, in mid-November, Operation Uranus, trap the Germans from the west, just as the Germans had trapped the English and the French from the west in Belgium and northern France at the end of May 1940. And that was the end of the German Sixth Army. But had the Germans prevailed against the Soviet forces in Stalingrad, then they wouldn't have been they would not have been as vulnerable as they were, and could have reconsolidated their positions and strengthened their rear lines in order to defend the salient. But they were completely preoccupied with destroying the Soviets in this. It was like the Battle of Verdun. It was a battle of a symbol at Stalingrad. So Stalingrad's pretty close too. It's hundreds of yards. If we could have the next line. And George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, reflected on this year, 1942. It was a near-run thing, as Wellington said about Waterloo, and talked about the thin thread of Allied survival. And he talks about very small units that decided the battles, talks about hours in those black days. And it's minutes when it comes down to the battle at Midway. It's a 10-minute interval. It's a half a kilometer at Stalingrad. It's those barges of supplies at Guadalcanal. But after Guadalcanal and after Stalingrad, and I'm leaving out now North Africa, but the Germans also did not advance further than El Alamein in the end. Their supply routes are too stretched. The pincer lacks its strength. The huge coordinated Axis offensive withers. Even so, It would take 2.5 years to drive the Germans out of the Soviet Union. The Americans would not engage in a naval battle with the Japanese until late 1943, or attempt a land invasion of another island until November 1943. But in retrospect, the Axis got no further than they did in October and November 1942. We're going to have the next slide. No wonder in 1942 that everyone was calling for the Second Front, and this is a David Lowe cartoon about two Soviet soldiers in the midst of heated battle, wondering about the news. What do they say about the Second Front? And it didn't come because the United States and the British, for good strategic reasons, were not going to do a headlong assault against Western Europe. And ultimately, the Soviets believed that the Operation North Africa was inadequate. Everyone's calling for the Second Front, but there are, in fact, many, many second fronts in World War II. And that gives shape to the drama of 1942. If we could have the next slide. So it begins with the fifth column, the famous fifth column inside Madrid that would aid the four nationalist columns invading the Republican city in July 1936. And the idea of the fifth column races around the world as the internal enemy, as the ideological enemy. Lindbergh, for example, was very, very offended that people thought he was a fifth columnist for Germany in 1940, United States. This is a map of the Japanese diaspora around the world. And I show this, and we can just jump to the next slide, is that Japanese settlement and Japanese residents were all over Latin America, a very big concentration in Brazil as well as the United States proportionately. But certainly all along the western coast of the Pacific in Canada, Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, Chile. And they are the target of persecution and segregation and internment. And this is not just a California thing. The Canadians are quite severe about the internment of a somewhat smaller population than California has. But with the aid of the U.S. State Department, there's also the kidnapping and deportation of Japanese citizens of their respective Latin American countries in Peru and in Panama and Colombia and Bolivia. Bolivia, 20% of the Japanese population is ultimately, after the war, deported to Japan. So Chile's not involved. They've refused to work with the United States. Brazil is also not involved because they have 250,000 Japanese residents. But otherwise, Japanese are, in fact, interned in the United States from points as far south as Peru, as well as Panama, Mexico, and so on. And then the Canadians have their own internment program. So that is one vision of the fifth column. The next slide shows the famous Dr. Seuss, the Dr. Theodore Geisel cartoon in PM, a left-wing daily in New York, where you have the stereotypical Japanese lining up to get their package of TNT and join the Popular Front as their chiefs look out for the arrival of the Japanese Navy. But there are other internal enemies for various reasons that fracture the unity or coherence of each of the sides, Allied and Axis, and are to some extent vital wars, vital second fronts. If we could have the next slide. not sure in which order they come. Yeah, so these are the incarceration sites. So it involves about 200,000 people. Incidentally, Hawaii, with a population of 37% Japanese ancestry, does not incarcerate anybody, and they can't because they're too economically valuable. But it's also a territory run by the military, and is not susceptible to political pressure and has very few white nativist voices that could put on that pressure. But the Japanese in Hawaii are untouched for all intents and purposes. If we could go next slide. So yeah, I mean, Detroit, the great arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it. There were so many jobs open in Detroit for what is the equivalent of $25 an hour in today's money. There were just 8 pages of wanted ads in the free press. It was a boom town that was attracting immigrants from all over. But there was tremendous social and ethnic pressures. When people moved from the South, that included white Southerners as well as black Southerners, and reaching Detroit without a proper housing stock. The Life magazine reflects on Detroit's actually dynamite, and asks whether Detroit's going to blow up Hitler with its arms or it's going to blow up the United States with the fight among its munitions workers, um, and gives us sort of a survey of the basically its ethnic tensions inside Detroit, which are similar to those that existed in many other big cities. But the main point of friction is the newly arrived Southern whites and the newly arrived Southern blacks. And riots do take place in Detroit in July 1943. If we could have the next slide. Here's the riot in 43. Next slide. The Japanese also had internal enemies and had a very fearsome occupation. In fact, there's a few traces of Japanese occupation left in the memory of Southeast Asia, other than the arbitrary violence, especially the slap in the face, but also the required bows to Japanese authorities and in choreographed ceremonies to the emperor in the direction of Tokyo. And these, as you can see, were very deep bows. And even these deep bows did not necessarily save thousands and thousands of Chinese who were targeted by the Japanese in haphazard fashion in their purification purges against Chinese who were seen as anti-communist, correctly, anti-communist, anti-Japanese, correctly. And so tens of thousands of Chinese lost their lives, especially in initial massacres. And Singapore in late February 1942 is the most famous. And proportionally, the number of Japanese civilians murdered in Singapore in February 1942 is greater than the number of Polish civilians murdered in Warsaw in 1940 and 41. So these are huge numbers. But there's no systematic destruction of Chinese life. But the diaspora is huge. And through the Philippines, throughout Indonesia, as well as Malaya, where they constitute almost 50% of the population. So that's another fault line. If we could have the next slide. Then Quit India. I don't have a good photograph of Quit India, so I use the commemorative stamps that came out in 2017 on the 75th anniversary. I want to say one thing about Quit India. So this is a resolution of the Congress Party that now, do or die, now, we will get rid of the British. This is not negotiation. This isn't a little bit of insurrection in order to bring the British to the negotiation table. This isn't to set a timetable for independence. This is to kick out the British in 4 weeks now. And in fact, all the insurrection is described in the present tense. I am now laying down my life for India. And it blows up in August 1942 after the famous Bombay Resolution and the arrests of Nehru and Gandhi and others. And it lasts for about 4 weeks and fails. But it's a huge insurrection, mostly confined to Hindu middle class districts. But it is huge in scale and is the biggest threat to the British Empire internally since 1857, and even so during World War II. The British also had to contend with Dutch resistance in South Africa to World War II. So Quit India is a sign that Hindu nationalists believed that Britain was about to lose the war, and this was their chance not only to kick out the British, but to create a unitary state without going through huge, long negotiations about federal structure with the Muslim League. So to Quit India is a little bit of two things: to immediately create a succession from Britain to Congress. The next slide, please. I spent a long time about the infrastructure of the Holocaust, the creation of a systematic top-down plan run out of Berlin and out of the Chancellery that is set in motion with the beginning of the World War that was always Hitler's prophecy going back to 39. If there's a world war among the nations, the result will be not the Bolshevization of the world, but the Vernichtung, the destruction, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And this world war comes to pass with the German declaration on the United States on December 11th. This is not the cause of the Holocaust, and millions of Jews had already been murdered. But it sets in motion the systematic infrastructure and administrative apparatus that will coordinate trains and schedules and top-down, state-driven, SS-run murder in a period of tremendous murder between probably June 1942 and October 1942, in which 3/4 of those innocent victims who will be killed are killed in the middle of 1942 inside this administrative plan that coordinates trains and deportations around Europe and in Poland. So that is a successful second front that the Germans fought. And the final slide. I could also show refugees Indian refugees coming out of Burma, or the flood refugees from China, or the refugees from the famine in Bengal, India in 43. Suffice to say, there are a lot of people on the road. There's workers going to the boom towns like Detroit. There's refugees. There's fifth column enemies being driven to prison or elsewhere. And in the United States, there's a final front that I just wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the African American struggle, particularly promoted by newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, who push the idea that there has to be two wars fought at once, like victory, like you put up two fingers at once, not one after the other, but two at once: victory at home and victory abroad. Victory abroad against Hitler, victory abroad against militarists who would seize independent countries like Poland, but victory at home as well, in the name of one man, one vote, one person, one vote, in the name of getting rid of the poll tax, in the name of the end of state-sanctioned segregation in the form of Jim Crow or informal Jim Crow in the North. These two battles had to be fought at the same time. And the double victory at home and abroad. And this was a huge mobilizing effort. It also created a backlash. And there is concerted Southern awareness of what they called an incursion to the rights of states, just like the German invasion of Poland, so also Washington's invasion and the liberal invasion of the Southern states through fair employment practices and anti-Jim Crow efforts, and a kind of a belief that the double victory was a victory against Hitler and a victory against the meddling against the Southern way of life. And so the double V campaign, African American double V campaign, is again doubled again when you see the consolidation of the solid South, the filibuster against the end of the poll tax in early November 1942, and continued resistance. We now, in retrospect, think that's all futile. The civil rights movement will come, but that's not the way it seemed in 1942. It was seen as a battle line for a beleaguered set of rights, one held by white Southerners, others by black Southerners. Next slide. And this shows the migration in America. 10% of America crossed state lines in World War II to work elsewhere. Since America is so big, it doesn't show how big the Californian, the Examiner called it the second gold rush, was the stomping out of huge cities that would build the ships, the expansion of LA into basically the second largest city in the country at that time, Portland, Seattle as well. But a general movement to the north again, as we had seen in World War I, but also to the west, and the depopulation, white and black, of the more rural precincts in the South. So this is a massive migration, 10%. It has all sorts of effects. I mean, it creates a permanent African American presence in the West, enlarges it in the cities like Detroit and Chicago. It makes country music wildly popular all across the United States, and it's not just a little program on a radio station now, but it is a standard jukebox selection. That's just a few. I mean, the swing bands, Roy Acuff doesn't go to the Pacific by invitation of the Navy. Glenn Miller does, but it's swing and country in the United States. Next slide. The sense that there's a lot of disunity is true. And that's why I wrote this book. I wonder if lessons of 1942 is that the next war is going to be much more like 1942 than the clear resolution of Hiroshima in 1945 and the building of cooperative structures like NATO. What if it's 1942, where the fear was not the end of the world, but the endlessness of the war? In mutual recrimination and division in these second fronts that cut across the bias of the Allies and the Axis. And that's part of the picture I want to paint. The fragileness of the unity that was created. And yet that unity, symbolized by the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, also created enormous moral energy. Many of the second fronts around the world were to advance the goals of what people called the People's War, our war. The Double V campaign among African Americans is a case in point. Quit India in India is a case in point. And so wasn't Roosevelt's idea, certainly, certainly not Churchill's idea, to have this huge expansion of the Atlantic Charter into what the New York Times called a democratic bomb. But so it was. So in many ways, the signs of disunity were also simply a sign of the strength and the multiplication of the ideals of national self-determination and choosing your own leaders that we see in the Atlantic Charter. That said, though, the ennoblement of self-rule led to persecution of minorities, did not lead to peace, led to often parochial viewpoints, cuts against the bias of regional security arrangements. We see the growing illegitimacy of institutions like NATO. And as the challenges that confront us only increase, whether they be economic inequality or migration, which will not cease, or climate change, which exists and will get worse and will get much, much worse. We don't talk about it anymore. COVID took it off the pages. Trump took it off the page. It's still there, though. Um, One wonders, will there be a coming together like the Atlantic Charter, or will it be many, many, many city-states and republics of self-rule that I tried to outline in the indices of self-rule, but also disunity that undercut the coherence of both the Allies and the Axis, as was so visible in 1942. I'm not one to give up on moral unity. There are some people who are cynical and say it's all a big imperialist war. I don't go that far, but I do see the fissures and the fractures and the hate and the impatience. I thank you kindly on this 23rd of September, 2025, and we'll see where we are in 2042.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. That was a great talk. I see a number of questions in the queue already, so I will go with Tom asked, you referred to American airmen flying kamikaze missions. Was this an actual policy among American airmen?
No, these airmen were brave heroes, but they were, I don't know. What I now am saying, I don't know. I mean, they fought under very, very difficult circumstances. They did not have coordination, air to air or air to ship. The weaponry was not good. The planes were not good. The mission was badly conceived to begin with. The men probably knew it and did it anyways. Um, and went if they didn't know they were going to their deaths, most of them did.
Okay, a few more here, Mike. I know your hand's raised. We'll take two more in the queue and then go to you. Brandon asks, what factor did the Axis most miss in 1942? In other words, was there any single factor that they could have but didn't address that, if better handled, could have significantly?
Yeah, well, they weren't very nice. Most of the civilians actually killed rather than dying of starvation are killed by the Axis. And in China, in Slavs in Europe, Jews in Europe, the upfront racism of, in particular, the Germans, but also the rigid hierarchy of the Japanese as they conceived of their Asian sphere, worked completely against them, so that Burmese allies in 42 turn against the Japanese in 44 and join the British. Similar things happened in Malaysia. The Germans had some collaboration, but they could have had far more had it not been for German racism. Of course, if it weren't for German racism, the Germans wouldn't have been in the Soviet Union in the first place. So that's the racism is really debilitating. The Germans got more material out of the Soviet Union during the period of the non-aggression pact than they plundered from the Soviet Union after its end. This is not a reality-based war. The Germans are nuts. The Japanese also had few resources, but didn't also invest them in the right places, and weren't able to protect the shipping in their far-flung ocean-going empire. So they had a huge supply problem. They couldn't get what they had conquered, and they couldn't supply their army properly. Already from the very beginning of the fall of 1942, the biggest singular lack is lack of coordination. They did not coordinate. They did not plan together. They did not confer with one another. They did not warn each other. The Japanese had tremendous mistrust of the Germans, and the Germans also had mistrust of the Japanese because as racial inferiors. But they did not coordinate well at all. The one, I mean, but they both shared, the Indian independence leader Bose. He's a little bit in Tokyo, a little bit in Berlin, but there's no coordination. There's no coordination.
Could a follow-up question is that could the coordination have made any difference or prolong the war?
Yeah, it would have prolonged the war. Who knows what a fast strike would have done in the late spring of 1942? But Germany puts more horses into the field in 42 than it did in 41. Its supplies are drawn by horses. They call them Panya horses. We called ours jeeps. We're a motorized army. We're not marching on foot once we get to the front, the United States. We have huge capacity. And it's not just scale, it's automation, it's other technological techniques. We mass produce good enough. The Germans handicraft very good. These stereotypes still have a degree of purchase. Germans never built a four-engine bomber. They didn't build enough submarines when they might have had a chance in the summer of 1940 at starving Britain. There are a lot of missteps. Germany very much, both of them live on the capital of their astonishing victories. The Japanese with their victory fever after Pearl Harbor, and the Germans fought on the capital of their victory over France until April 1945.
Fascinating. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, please forgive me if there's any background noise here. There's basically two questions. One, well, first of all, a couple of points. I would take issue that Midway was pure dumb luck. I mean, there was a lot of luck involved, but there was some skill involved, obviously. But getting to the two issues, the two questions. One of them, the first one is, isn't the, shall we say, the fall of the British Empire, so to speak, at least in colonial sense, didn't that have at least, wasn't that due at least in part to the further democratization of the British forces, of or the forces under British command, and at home? There was a growing, shall we say, feeling among the common civilians and soldiers in Britain, or in the British Empire, that was kind of moving against this kind of thing. That's one question. And the other question is, in Europe, the Allied, shall we say, the U.S. daylight precision bombing campaign had just started at the end of 42, combined with the RAF bombing and with the German diversion, however much it was, of forces for the Holocaust. Wasn't that kind of another turning point in that it turned Germany, in other words, it was putting Germany much more on the defensive? I mean, it was really the start of Germany on the defensive.
Yeah, so I'll just go backwards. one of the key differences of World War I, World War II is the Germans knew they lost. And they knew they lost because all they had to do was look around at the cities, at the inability to move in 1945, at the losses in their own family, at the far-flung territorial losses, but also the refugees streaming. It was just very, very, very clear. And the bombing had a lot to do with that. The bombing's crucial to the invasion of Normandy, but Germany did not collapse. It did not. What bombings of the cities is supposed to do is create conditions of internal chaos, and it didn't do that. So 100,000 Allied airmen died, killing 600,000 German civilians. And I don't think that's worth it. And most of the airmen died at the beginning, and most of the civilians died at the end, which makes it even more weird. But I think things like Normandy, air power and air cover was absolutely crucial. There are no resources diverted to the Holocaust. Holocaust cost nothing.
No,
It's two trains a day. Say it's 10. Say it's 100. There are 25,000 trains that are in operation every single day in the German Reich. And these are trains, the trains they need are the trains that can transport troops and the trains that can transport tanks. This is not what was in use to transport people to Auschwitz. There is no diversion of resources.
actually, when I
There's
was
the
talking,
requirement for coordination because you can't do it without the French police. You can't do it without the Dutch police. You can't do it without French trainmen or Dutch trainmen. But there's no diversion. In terms of the multinational, the largest volunteer army in the world in World War II is the Indian Army. But half of it, for various reasons, joins the anti-British forces when they're captured in Malaya. But it's a multi-ethnic fighting force that is effective. And the large number of British soldiers who end up fighting as well are labor soldiers and view perhaps the world in a post-colonial way. And so the variety of viewpoints that you have, they're certainly big supporters of the Beveridge Plan in November 1942. So yeah, it's very easy to stereotype armies that are highly complex, and there are different definitions of what would be the end of the British Empire. And at the first moment, it didn't even look like that. In 1945, reestablishment of sovereignty in Burma and Malaya and Singapore. So, and long battles for independence in Indonesia and elsewhere. So, no, it's certainly not crystal clear.
actually, the thing I was going to say about the point I was making about the bombing was the actual damage to German industry, the bombing of German industry, which was not happening in the United States and Canada.
No. Yeah, maybe there was a little damage. I'm sure there was. But the basic premises were never fulfilled. There was only one bombing that succeeded in fulfilling the premises, and that was Hiroshima. I say this, a little, off the cuff, but you go to Berlin, this is not a city that was bombed to destruction. The railroads were up and the Berlin subway is up and running by the beginning of June 1945.
But as far as industry goes, industrial
I'm
output.
sure the Germans were very, very hurt. And Speer is a accountant of that. But was it? Sure, and it hastened victory. There's certainly no doubt about that. But that's not the premise of pouring more resources into the United States Air Force and the RAF than any other military arm over 4 years. And you lose 100,000 men. It's a huge number.
Hey, Mike, thanks for the question. Peter, thank you very much for the talk. Very sobering. Again, the book is 1942, When World War II Engulfed the Globe by Peter Fritzsche. Please join us this Saturday, September 27 at 1 p.m. when Garrett Graff will discuss his book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb, which offers a panoramic narrative of how ordinary people grappled with extraordinary wartime risks. Hopefully you can join us. Until then, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And thank you, Peter, for a really fantastic talk. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.